quickly, so to speak. And then as a result of that, I was at the Tom's River Diner having breakfast, and the call came in, first aid call his house. And I remember getting his house, I remember they tried CPR, he did not make it. And I remember the wires still coming out of his body like it was yesterday, and stepping over his body, and his mother was so proud to show me a letter he wrote, which I still have to this day, about please don't let any other family go through what I'm going through. And it's certainly something that stays with you. And then we move forward, and now it's getting almost where we have calls every day. We have almost the type of call, which, if anybody get offended, please, see where to go, where my IT go. I think you want to play that? This is a typical call this weekend, and we just had one last night in Point, another one not make it. These are the typical where it starts from the law enforcement end, just so you can appreciate it. Yep. And just forget, they were supposed to bleed out the names and addresses. Just dispatching.
Sir, how old is he?
Right now. Was typed in the
Sir,
computer,
how old
sent
is
over.
he? Hey, Flint, Ocean County, I think was on the phone. Right in front of your Squad 35 house. He's thinking his friend is having an overdose. He's going to be in a great Honda Accord. I'm trying to get some more information right now. Sir, how old is he?
He's 19 or 20. He's 20 years old.
Okay. All right, we're gonna send medics. No, it's for a 20-year-old male overdose of unknown substance. He didn't say. He doesn't know. It's gonna be in the parking lot of Squad 35 building, 1200 Beaver Dam Road. Yeah, he's gonna be waiting for you guys in the Great Honda Accord.
Where's the first aid?
Okay, so you get a feel for what they have to walk through and stuff like that. All right, you get a feel for what they have to go through. These calls are coming in. And yesterday I was at the hospital, a new officer was being trained at security. And all of a sudden, part of his training is when they drop off the bodies at the front and you have to go get a wheelchair and drag them in and that type of thing. And that's what we see. We see it, and I have to say that type of call years ago would be rare. This is normal, and our dispatchers handle over 325,000 911 calls a year, and they're getting these calls just about every day now. A lot have been Narcan back. Our prosecutor has done an excellent job in getting the Narcan program going. We've had 2 saves. But even for an old-timer like me, I had 2 narcotics arrests last year. That's not supposed to happen. I'm too old to lock people up, okay? But I was coming in the courthouse one day, and I walked by the stairs, you know where the stairs are there, and I look at my car and I see a guy going like this up to his nose. I said, what is that? So, was it your client? So I walk up to him and I start looking, and I thought he had a needle. It turned out he had a straw, and he was snorting, cleaner for the computer. he looks up, I said, what are you doing? And he said, none of your business, man. I'm just here to see Judge Daniels, which I accommodated him. I brought him right in. So the next one was this summer. We have, when there's ever a storm with OEM, we put officers out on the road. Well, we had a thunderstorm come through, and it was hitting Barnegat and the western part out by Warren Grove. So I'm out there on 539. I see a car off to the side of the road with flashers on, and I come up, and here I'm arresting a 65-year-old gentleman who's snorting heroin in his car on his birthday. He said, oh, can't you let me go? It's my birthday. And so not even trying to find it, I'm not even looking for it, and it's there. So it's throughout the county. It is a real problem. Then we had, which you know the other night, we had a young man, and they are conners. These people can get over on you, you know, and I hate to say that. Look, we had in our own agency, we had to lock up one of our command officers. He was a sniper in the Marine Corps, excellent. He's one of our hardest workers my impression, when I got there, because I didn't know him before I got to the office 3 years ago. And unfortunately, we looked at something, we had a little problem with quality control when we do audits of our drugs that come through the lab, and something was missing. And I'm not sleeping at night going, my wife's saying, what are you, freaking crazy? What are you doing this job for? And because I'm saying we're missing stuff, and we may never know where it went. And that's very scary. But we did an investigation and worked with the prosecutor's office, and we were able to find out that this individual is responsible. Now he's going to be accountable. You know, how it affects, so it's not only, you know, it affects families, it affects police families too, because not only as an organization do we have to deal with him, but we have to deal with the officers he worked with who second-guess themselves, such as myself. What did I miss? How come I didn't see this? Why didn't we know about this? And we now know that this was going on for some time. It wasn't something new. And ironically, he was the guy who backed me on 539 on the drug arrest. So it's like mind-boggling. But anyhow, what we're here to talk about today is the, you know, Special K, these other things that are added. You know, they say, I think the new governor running wants to legalize marijuana. I'm hearing, is that correct? Anybody hear that? Yeah. So it's marijuana. Listen, as a young police officer, and you go to a fight, and somebody's drinking, right? You say, hey, you know, they want to fight you. They get beer muscles. Marijuana say, hey, man, everything's cool, right? So from a police officer's perspective, it wasn't bad. But then they add all this stuff to it. That's what really concerns us. And you don't know what you have. You know, potpourri, they call it, the incense. Whether it be angel dust or some of the things Justin go over. But these are concerns, certainly, that you have to have the reactions to it. So we had one case about 4 years ago in Toms River where we were getting reports from High School East that they were selling at an Exxon station on Fisher Boulevard. And we started making patrol buys, and they had to hide behind the desk, whatever. We went in, and then we did a search warrant, and they came up with like, I think it was like $300,000 in cash on that job, Sean O'Keefe, and we worked the job with DEA, and the stuff was coming from California and then from Mexico, and you don't know what these people put on this stuff. Ironically, when we were doing that investigation to get the search warrant, Lou Santora, one of our detectives, was coming down on a robbery investigation that happened at Grand Union, and he's tracking down a car up in Edison, and he's coming down the parkway, and the car's all over the way. Well, if you're an unmarked and plainclothes detective or sheriff or whatever, you really don't want to get involved with certain things. So they're trying not to get involved, but they had to stop the car. They pushed it into a guardrail. When they get up there, it turns out that this lady, who was driving crazy at 20-some years old, bought the stuff, and we ran it into the affidavit for the search warrant down at the same Exxon station. But her driving and her ability and her safety, what she did to public safety, is crazy. So on this topic, you want to talk about some of the other things, and that's why we have Justin here. Justin came from Gettysburg College. He's been with the sheriff's office in the lab under the direction of Matt Wood. We handle 4,000 cases a year at the lab, and I know some of you have come in and seen what we do over there. And with the freeholders, we're actually moving over to get the lab certified. They bought about $1.5 million in new equipment, so we'll be state-of-the-art certified within the next year. And we're moving our our investigators, a CSI, into the building next door. But Justin's been with us, and he tested drugs, and we had, the prosecutor come over and look at all the drugs that we have to test. We're running out of room. We were just in there for a meeting the other day, because we have so much coming in. And a lot of what we have coming in is 40%, I believe, heroin right now, where it used to be like 10%, according to Dr. Wood when he first started. So a dramatic increase in the heroin and the pills. But these synthetics out there, and they keep changing the chemical. Now, I'm not a chemistry major like Justin. Justin is in the lab. He tests drugs, so he's going to give you a little overview about what's happening in the lab and what we do at the Sheriff's Office. Justin Victoria. Justin?
Sheriff? Do I need the mic? Can everybody hear me? Okay.
Yep.
No, it's all right. All right, can everybody see that? Kind of a... These sideways, we can see both their heads.
Not now. While he's doing that, why don't you just tell us about your history in chemistry?
All right. As the sheriff said, I've been with the sheriff's office for 3 years, and what I'm going to talk to you today about is stuff that we are actually seeing submitted to our forensics lab. And I'll talk about some of the legislation being passed over to fight these new emerging drugs that we're seeing, both the synthetic cannabinoids. I'll talk a little bit about the new synthetic opioids, which are a ever-emerging and very dangerous substance that we're now seeing a lot of in the county. What I'll do in this talk is I'll give you a little more of a background of what the sheriff was saying as far as what the investigation unit does, what we're comprised of. I'll talk a little bit about some of the drugs we're seeing, some of the ways we test them, and again, I'll go into some of the legislature, both at the federal and the state level, as far as what we're seeing.
Yeah, right. While he's doing that, why don't you just move forward?
Okay. Well, I'll talk a little bit about the unit I work with. As far as the sheriff's office goes, my unit is the Crime Scene Investigations Unit. We're comprised of 12 sworn officers, detectives. We have 3 sergeants, 2 lieutenants, and a captain. And the role of the detectives is anytime there's a major crime in the county, thefts, burglaries, up to homicide, shootings, that kind of deal, the detectives will go out and analyze that crime scene, collect the evidence, and bring it back to our headquarters just down the street on Chestnut Street. No municipality has a forensics lab or a crime scene unit, so we control all the crime scene investigations for the county. And in addition to the sworn officers, there is a group of civilians. I'm a civilian. I don't have a badge, I don't have a gun, but I still work for the sheriff's office. 4 forensic chemists, including myself. We have 2 photo lab technicians, a clerical staff, and 2 fingerprint examiners. When the detectives go out and collect fingerprints at some of these crime scenes, they'll bring it back, and our fingerprint examiners will be able to work with the fingerprints and identify them. The lab, I said, is there's 4 of us. Our lab director, Matt Wood, he's been with the sheriff. He started in 1994, and he left in 2000 to work at the state police for a few years, but we brought him back in 2011 to become our lab director. And he is, in addition to doing drug chemistry, which all 4 of us, forensic chemists with the sheriff, we all test drug chemistry for seized drug material. Matt also is one of our toxicologists, which is testing drugs in bodily fluids. The other three chemists, in addition to myself, do toxicology. Matt, are we good here? Yeah. In addition to drug chemistry, Matt does toxicology. We have 2 senior forensic chemists. Joanne Maffey has been with the sheriff since 1995. She does drug chemistry, toxicology, and she also does blood spatter analysis. Anytime a crime scene has blood spatter, she'll go out with the detectives, helping with that. We have Heather Dover as our other forensic chemist. She's been with the sheriff since 2003, I believe. And in addition to drug chemistry and toxicology, she is our firearms examiner. Are we green light? Okay. We got 2 slides. That's an actual picture of our lab. It's not that color anymore. This is an older picture. We painted it not too long ago. That's Matt Wood in the foreground there on one of the instruments, and that's Heather in the back. Heather's on our comparison microscope because Heather's one of our firearms examiners. She and Steve Deedy work with firearms cases submitted to this lab. And Heather and Steve are 2 very highly qualified firearms examiners. They have qualifications that not many people have in the entire country, so we're very lucky to have them as our firearms examiners. And I've been fortunate enough to kind of peek over their shoulder at what they do. They're both very good at what they do, and we're lucky to have them.
And I can add, they are 2 qualified people. There's only 30 people that match their qualifications in the United States of America. We have 2 right here in Ocean County.
Yeah, they're both extremely good at what they do, and we're lucky to have them. And then there's me. I've been with the sheriff since 2013. I don't have a specialty. I'm not doing toxicology yet. Matt wants me to do toxicology. We'll see. So a little bit about our statistics. The sheriff touched base on this a little bit. We get approximately 4,000 drug cases submitted to the lab a year. Majority of that is seized drug material coming from our municipalities. Like I said, none of the municipalities have a forensics lab. All that material would come to us. We do also have to deal with overdose cases. Anytime there's a fatal overdose, our detectives are going out, processing that scene. If they get any drugs or drug paraphernalia from that scene, they'll submit it to us, and we analyze that. And in 2000, I think that's the 2016 number, we had about 200 fatal overdoses in the county. We get about 100 toxicology samples, which for the time being, we're only testing drugs in urine and blood alcohol concentration. We're looking to expand that a little bit with some of the equipment the sheriff said that we had purchased in the past year. And that will allow us to do tests for drugs and blood samples, which will also allow us to do post-mortem blood analysis for drugs. Steve and Heather also have to deal with about 300 firearms cases a year. For the most part, they're from shootings and operability. Operability is any time there's a seized firearm, whether it's considered an illegal firearm by New Jersey statute, or if you get arrested for some other reason, you get your you get your guns confiscated. They have to prove that it is indeed a functioning firearm. They'll test it in operability. We have what's called a cotton box down in the basement. They can shoot the guns into the cotton box and prove that the firearm actually does work. This is a breakdown of our drug prevalence from 2016. It goes up to about October. We stopped keeping track of this in October when we got our new LIM system, our computer system. And this shows you exactly what we're seeing in the county. So the large blue, 30%, that's marijuana. That's not surprising that marijuana is the most prevalent. The green is heroin, and the green there is 25%. The sheriff said that's kind of low for what we were seeing. What I think happened here is, since this is from October, we're finishing up the cases from the summer. You see a lot of marijuana in the summer, given where we are. You see more heroin in the winter months, and I have seen at times the heroin will actually surpass marijuana for prevalence. But for the most part, those numbers are about the same. We usually say it's about a third and a third as far as marijuana and heroin in the county. The red, which is 8%, it's kind of hard to read, is cocaine. We really don't see a lot of cocaine, mostly marijuana and heroin. Some other things to note, the purple next to the heroin, that's fentanyl. About 5% of what we're seeing now contains fentanyl or a fentanyl analog of some kind. And we're doing what we can to combat that. It's difficult given the rise of the new fentanyls that are really rare and haven't been seen in some places. The blue 9% is prescription drugs. Painkillers or antidepressants are the most common that we get, and we have to analyze those if they're considered illegal. You know,
Excuse me,
prescription form.
just let me know.
Yes.
Going to the national sheriffs and having immigration come in and DEA, what they are saying though is the cartels are ready to import a lot of cocaine now. They're stockpiling on the other side of the border, waiting for the wall, waiting for more security, and they figure they can make more profit on the cocaine than they are on the heroin. So they're getting ready to infuse this country with a lot of cocaine, so you're gonna see that change in the next 1 to 5 years. So, you know,
So talking a lot about the drugs that we're seeing, well, what exactly is a drug? By definition, a drug is any substance that can cause a physiological or psychological change in a person. You can break this down into two ideals, the medical versus the non-medical. The medical are drugs made by pharmaceutical companies to improve or prolong life, whereas the non-medical is to use for recreational purposes, whether to escape the realities of life, like I said, make you feel good. The only difference between a drug and a poison is a matter of dosage. Think about that with painkillers. You take one, your wisdom teeth that you got pulled out feel better, but if you take more than that, you're not going to really feel all that great. We can look at drug dependence two ways, physiological or psychological. Physiological, usually you hear that as referred to as withdrawal symptoms, where your body reacts violently if you stop taking that drug. And it causes that physical dependence on the drug. The psychological end is for the people that use it recreationally. They get to that high emotional state. They like the way it makes them feel. If they come off of that, you go through, you get addicted to it, and it makes you feel like you can't function in normal everyday life without being on that drug. So what I'm going to talk about first is marijuana. As the sheriff said, we're going to talk about marijuana. That should segue us into more of these synthetic drugs. And I'll talk about marijuana. As you saw, it's the most prevalent drug we get. It comes from the cannabis plant, and it contains substituents called cannabinoids. There's many, many, many. I don't know off the top of my head exactly how many there are. The most common one is delta-9 THC. That's the one that gets all the press. Cannabinol and cannabidiol are two commonly detected ones. Different labs throughout the country require you to identify the different cannabinoids. We are only concerned with THC for the time being. And when it's submitted to the lab, it can come in many forms. The most common is a plant form, whether it's in its natural vegetative state or altered somehow if it's ground up. Extracted resin, which is commonly referred to as hashish, we see some of that. And lately we've been seeing a lot of oil extracts and waxes where they are actually extracting the THC from the plant, liquefying it, and what you get is a very highly concentrated and purified THC. And people are ingesting that in some way. A few more facts. Marijuana is the second most abused drug in the country behind ethanol, alcohol. Your alcoholic beverages or distilled spirits. As I said, a drug causes physiological and physical changes. Alcohol is considered a drug. About 40% of the population is acknowledged to trying marijuana. That's almost half the country has acknowledged that they have tried marijuana at least at some point. And marijuana is regulated by the DEA as a Schedule 1. The DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration, keeps a list of illicit substances, and they categorize them based on their medical use and their potential for abuse. So if a substance has no medical use and a high potential for abuse, it falls in the Schedule 1 category. If it has medical use and a potential for abuse, it falls in the Schedule 2 category, and so on and so forth, down to Schedule 3, which has medical use but a less chance of abuse than a Schedule 2, so on down the list to Schedule 5. Marijuana is classified as a Schedule 1. Heroin is a Schedule 1. LSD is a Schedule 1. Ecstasy is a Schedule 1. Marijuana falls in the category with those substances. When we get marijuana submitted to the lab, there's a group of tests that we can do, and the way our lab does it is we follow the SWIG drug recommendations. SWIG drug is the scientific working group for the analysis of seized drugs. The scientific working group has a set of recommendations for just about any forensic technique. There's a SWIG tox for toxicology. I'm pretty sure there's a SWIG gun for drugs. I think there's a SWIG dog for canine. So if you're in forensics, chances are there's a SWIG recommendation for you. And for the analysis of seized drugs, they have it broken down into different categories as far as what different tests can do and how you can use these tests. And for marijuana, they suggest you can use 3 of these, or GCMS at the bottom can count as 2, because it is 2 instruments and it's more confirmatory than these other ones, which I'll talk briefly about here. The first test is a macroscopic examination. That's physically looking at your question. Oh, I'm just scratching your nose. I thought I saw you raise your hand. That's physically looking at what we have submitted to us. Personally, I use a macroscopic examination, if we get a physical plant submitted, like on the top right there. For a piece of evidence to be considered a plant, it has to have roots, leaves, and stems. And I should say that plants do have different laws and legislation governing them versus if you submit loose vegetation. So that's why it's important, if something's being presented to us as a plant, we need to identify it as having roots, leaves, and stems. It seems obvious, but I can't tell you how many times police officers come to us and say, look, we have a plant, but they've chopped it out and they don't have the roots on it. We can't call it a plant because there's no roots. The other thing we look for is with the leaves. And there's, on the bottom left of my cluster of pictures, that's a typical marijuana leaf. And the one thing, there's a couple things we look for with that. One is the serrated edges of the leaf. And the leaves are always bunched in odd numbers. So you see this one has 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 bunches of leaves around it. I've seen 5, I've seen 7, 9. They're always in odd bunches. Sometimes difficult to determine that. If the plant's kind of dry and brittle, the leaves fall off. So you try to find one that looks a little fresh and count the number and make sure it's an odd number of leaves. We also can identify it by the flowering buds. The picture's a little blurry, but you can see that that plant is starting to flower. My earlier picture, I had a picture of the flowering bud. It grows right at the base where all the leaves kind of intersect. The bottom right is a zoomed in picture of the flowering bud. That's mostly what we get submitted to us in bud form. We still get plants occasionally, but for the most part we're seeing those flowering buds. The next test we do is a microscope. And that's an actual picture of the microscopes that we all have at our desk. All 4 of us have one of those microscopes. And it's kind of hard to see in the picture, but sticking out the top is a camera. We now have the ability to hook our microscopes up to a computer, take a picture of what we're doing and what we're seeing, and actually attach that to our reports and submit that with our reports. And there's a couple things that we're looking for under the microscope. Marijuana has a group of distinct hairs, they're called, glandular hairs and cystolytic hairs. It's the only plant that contains both of them, but also will test positive for THC. That's why I say these early tests are kind of screening tests, because there are other plants out there that will contain both, but if you do the next set of tests, they won't test positive for THC. This is probably not going to work. Yeah, the pictures are a little blurry. The glandular hair is a bit of a broader hair, and at the end of it, it has kind of a round globule knob, and that's where the THC resin is, in the knobs of those glandular hairs. Those are a lot easier to find than the cystolithic hairs. Cystolithic hairs are commonly referred to as bear claws. I think they look more like thorns. They're kind of broad at the end and they angle to a bit of a point. And they're mostly found on the stem area and on the underside of the leaf, so they're sometimes a little more difficult to find than the glandular hairs. But you can easily identify both of them by looking at a piece of marijuana vegetation under a microscope. The next test we do is called the modified Duquesnoy-Levine test. And this is a color test, and it's the addition of 3 different reagents to a sample. The first is Duquesnoy reagent, which is ethanol, acetaldehyde, and vanillin. Vanillin is the substance that makes vanilla smell, so when everyone's making Duquesnoy in the lab, it smells really nice. Ethanol serves to extract the THC out of the marijuana vegetation. Acetaldehyde and vanillin then react with it, so that when you add hydrochloric acid to that, your liquid will turn the dark purple that you can see on the top of the test tube on the right. That used to be the test. It used to be those 2 reagents, it would turn purple, that was considered positive for THC or marijuana. Then a lot of false positives started to show up. Certain brands of instant coffee and tea, for some reason, would turn purple. And so we needed a way to clarify this test. And somewhere along the line, someone thought to add chloroform to that. And when you add chloroform, the layers will actually separate, like oil and water. And the chloroform, which is less dense than the other 2, will go to the bottom. And if that bottom layer retains that purple color, like in the test tube, that's considered positive. If you add chloroform to your tea or coffee, there will be no color change, or it will be kind of a lighter brown as opposed to purple. And as far as I know off the top of my head, marijuana is the only substance that will have both those reactions, turning purple and retaining that purple color in the bottom layer. There are 2 ways to do a Duquesnoy-Levine test. One is in the test tube, which is the way we do it in the lab. The other is called a NIC test, and these are what police officers will keep in their squad cars. And what it is it's a plastic bag, and inside the plastic bag are 3 little ampules of these 3 reagents. And they can, if they pull someone over, they think they have marijuana on them, they take a little bit of the vegetation, put it in the bag, seal it, and they break the ampules one by one, and it performs the color test for them. And you see it has instructions. So the first, there will be no color change, then it will turn purple, then the bottom layer will be purple, so they know how to deal with that. The next test is called thin layer chromatography, or TLC for short. And when we say chromatography, chromatography is separation science. So what you're doing is taking a whole and separating something into its different components. For marijuana, we're trying to isolate the THC. So we take a small amount of vegetation, a small amount of solvent, mix it up, and spot that liquid on a TLC plate. TLC plate is simply a 10 centimeter by 10 centimeter glass plate, and it's coated with a porous substance called silica gel. It feels like a really thin brittle powder. And the marijuana is put on the bottom of the plate, and the plate is placed in the developing chamber. Developing chamber is simply a glass box with a thin amount of solvent on the bottom of it. So when you dip the plate into it, the solvent actually navigates up the plate. Think about putting a paper towel in a glass of water. You can see the liquid rise up. That's the same exact process we're doing here. And as that liquid rises up the plate, it will actually separate the different components, whether or not it reacts with the liquid or with the silica gel. So after, and since it's wet, you can see how the liquid travels up the plate. And when it gets near the top, you take it out. And if any of you have ever worked with organic solvents, as soon as you take it out, it evaporates. So you're looking at a blank plate. That doesn't really help you. So you need to look at what happened, and you need to find what separated. So there's 2 ways to do that. One is to look at it under UV light. This is what I always did in college. But the way we do TLC in the lab now, that doesn't work. So we need to spray it. And we use a dark red spray called Fast Blue Bee. I don't really know why, because it's red. And this is actually a picture of a plate that I processed, I think in February, and there's 6 different cases on there. And when you spray the plate with the spray, these red spots will show up. So what does this all mean? There's 2 ways to figure out what we're looking at. One is to calculate what we call an RF value. That is taking the ratio of the distance that a spot traveled to the distance that the liquid traveled. But that's a lot of math. So we just match it to a visual standard. And if you see on the far left side of that plate, there's one spot that has nothing else under it. That's a THC standard that we get from a chemical company that's certified as being pure THC. We spot a little bit of that on the plate, and then we're able to match the THC from all those spots by simply looking at it. Again, these are just used as screening tests. This is not going to be confirmatory, but when you combine the TLC with the microscopic examination of the macroscopic and the Duquesnoy, that's enough to be considered positive. If you really want to go and confirm it, you got to bring out the heavy and expensive artillery. This is a gas chromatograph mass spectrometer. We call it GCMS for short. And we rarely do marijuana on this, but when we do, I'll explain how it works. A GCMS is 2 instruments in tandem. So on the right side is your GC. A GC is essentially an oven. It heats a substance up to a very high temperature. The way we run our GCs, we heat it up to about 300 degrees Celsius, which is about 570 Fahrenheit. Inside that GC is what we call a column. It's a thin glass tube that's wound up. When it's unwound, it spreads about 30 meters, which would probably go from about one end of this room to the other. And that column is coated with a substance similar to what we coat the TLC plates with. The substance gets injected into that column, and a GC will measure what's called retention time. It'll measure how long it takes to get from the injection port to the detector at the end. And it's called retention time because it's measuring how long the substance is retained on that column. After it goes through the column, it goes into the mass spectrum. The mass spectrum is essentially a fancy light bulb. And what it does is when a substance enters it, it gets bombarded with this light, and the molecule down at the molecular level will actually break down into different ions. And each compound has a different mass spectrum. No 2 compounds have the same mass spectrum. Some are very similar if they're related compounds of some kind, but no 2 of the exact same. So the way we use a GCMS is we have that time, but that's kind of arbitrary. What we can do is actually run the standard like we did on the TLC, compare the times, and then on top of that you have your mass spectrum, which is unique to that compound, and that gives you a good confirmatory test. The reason you're probably thinking, well, that sounds great, why don't you do that with everyone? Well, the TLC plate I did had 6 cases on it. If I did a microscopic examination, a Duquesnoy and a TLC on those 6 cases, that would probably take me about a half hour to write it and have it out the door. Well, the way a GC mass spec works is we have to show that it's not contaminated with any chemicals and anything. One run of a sample takes about 20 minutes on a GC. But with blanks, that takes another 20 minutes, so one sample takes about 45 minutes to run on a GC. Not very time effective if we can just do the other 3 tests I said and be done with 6 cases just like that. This is what we're seeing submitted to us. These are all pictures taken from the internet, nothing that we see, but this is just an example of what we're seeing submitted to us. Most commonly we get vegetation in some kind of plastic bag, a Ziploc sandwich bag. We've seen glass jars, mason jars, pickle jars, marijuana cigarettes that have been hand-rolled, either used or not used yet, various paraphernalia like grinders, bongs, and residues from glass bowls. When we get a glass bowl like that where there's no vegetation in it, we can actually rinse that out with solvent and run that on the mass spectrum. That is an example of when we would need to use a GCMS if we get something like this submitted to us. We're seeing a lot lately, and these are actual pictures from our lab. What we're seeing a lot lately are people utilizing electronic cigarettes to take THC products, and other products for that matter. We've seen all kinds of, whether it be the considered first generation electronic cigarettes were supposed to look like cigarettes. The new generational vape pens, e-liquids, we're getting all of that submitted to us. And I bring this up because we were part of the study, Matt Wood and I were invited by Virginia Commonwealth University to do a study they were doing on people using illicit substances in electronic cigarettes. So Matt and I pulled out some of our older cases. We pulled out a total of 8 cases from 2013 to 2015. Looked at the data again, reran some of them just to see what else may have been in there. And we were able to present this. Matt got to present it in Las Vegas. I presented it in Dallas. And it was part of this workshop on vaping that was done with VCU, a few other professors from other colleges in the country. And the purpose of our study was just to present findings from a forensic lab and show what we're seeing. Being from colleges and universities, they were more recent, research-oriented, finding what could be done with these electronic cigarettes, whereas we were showing what we were actually seeing. And I'll go through a few of the interesting ones from this. The first one, this was an e-liquid that was submitted to us, and this was empty when we got it, so we were able to rinse it out with solvent, test it, didn't find anything that interesting in it. What we found interesting was a couple things. Looking at the label, number one, this was actually manufactured in Brick, New Jersey. We looked at the label. The warning was pretty straightforward. Don't drink this, don't have your children touch it. Then we got to the ingredients. The first phrase after ingredients was may or may not contain. Which, if you're listing the ingredients, I'm asking what's in it. I don't want to have to figure it out myself. The other thing they say is may or may not contain USP grade propylene glycol. USP is US Pharmacopoeia. They don't grade chemicals. So I don't know where they got that from, but this shows you what kind of quality assurance that some of these companies have. We looked at their website. You can get Vapors brand e-liquid in any of 36 flavors, between $5.99 and $6.99, and they say they rated them by nicotine content. So they ranged in dosage from 0 to 24 milligrams of nicotine. However, they don't explain what that dosage is. Is there 24 milligrams of nicotine in that bottle? Is it per milliliter? Is it per suggested dose? Again, you and me are left to figure that out. So Matt and I were out at lunch someday talking about this case, and we were talking about the prevalence of the e-liquids, and we wanted to see what we could learn from them. So we paid a visit to them since they're in Brick. And, oh, you cannot see that. Well, that's what a GC mass spec looks like. But, okay, so we went to Vapors brand e-liquid in Brick, New Jersey, got a 0 milligram nicotine flavorless bottle of e-liquid, and came back to the office, injected it into our mass spec, and we got this big, messy chromatogram. You can't really see it. If you see the little blotchy things, those are numbers. Those are the retention times I was telling you about. Ideally, you want to see 1 or 2 of them. We had about 20, so that tells you all the different stuff that's in there. Well, the y-axis of the chromatogram is relative abundance. So we wanted to see if you were able to get this e-liquid and you had THC in it, were these other chemicals in here so abundant that we would not be able to see the THC? So what we did was we spiked our e-liquid with a little THC, and you can see right about here, there's a nice, that's what a GC peak is supposed to look like. Nice and narrow, nice and straight. That was a peak that we were able to identify. Now the bottom under that is the mass spectra. Those numbers on the top of that are the mass of those ions when it gets broken down in the mass spectra. And to me, that's like matrix code. I can look at that immediately and see what that is, and it was THC. So this proves that, and I forget off the top of my head how much we dosed it with, it was not a lot. That proves that if you have any THC in the e-liquid, in at least Vapors brand, you should be able to find it. Another interesting case we had was this. This was an oral syringe that was submitted with a large quantity of vegetation, In our line of work, we would call that a clue. We had a little bit of an idea of what this was, but we weren't exactly sure. So we injected it into the mass spec, and we got this. Now with this, you can't really see, but that peak, it slopes up along all of those numbers and then comes down. That substance stayed on the column for about 5 minutes. That's not really that good. And what that substance was is glycerol. So it was just the base liquid that they were using in that syringe. There's another little peak there next to it. It was actually at 1141, and the mass spectrum from that peak is under there. That should look familiar. It was THC. So looking at this, we wanted to see if there was a way we could clean this up, maybe get rid of that glycerol peak, just to make sure that, since I said relative abundance, we wanted to make sure we weren't missing anything. So on this substance, we performed what's called a solid phase extraction. Solid phase extraction is a process we use in our detecting drugs in urines to clean up the urine, get rid of all the waste and byproducts like that. So we did the exact same solid phase extraction on this to try to isolate the THC, and we found this. So it got rid of that glycerol peak. And this is a zoom in of the chromatogram, and we were able to find THC. But remember I said there was more cannabinoids in marijuana than just THC? We were able to identify 7 different cannabinoids just from doing a simple solid phase extraction like that. And that's important for 2 reasons. Number one, I said different labs throughout the country need to identify different cannabinoids. This shows you that doing a simple solid phase extraction can find probably any cannabinoid they would need to find. I don't know any labs that need to identify tetrahydrocannabivarin. I know some that need to identify cannabinol, some need to identify delta-8 THC. So this proves that you can do that. This is important for another reason in that this proves that that liquid started out as a natural organic vegetation. The only other way that you can do this is if the suspect physically went through, identified each of those cannabinoids, and then for some reason mixed them all together again. Chances are they did not do that. So this shows that it came from a natural organic vegetation, which is another thing that some labs need to do. They need to prove, if they get a liquid or a hash oil like that, they need to prove that it came from a vegetative source. So what exactly does marijuana do to your brain? Well, in the 1990s, a group of scientists discovered that cannabinoids react with your drug receptor CB1, later discovered as both CB1 and CB2. And humans also produce a natural, they called it an endocannabinoid called anandamide that affects your immune system. And so now we're starting to get a bit more of a scientific look into what marijuana actually does to you, but what does that actually mean? Well, the scientists wanted to see if there's medical benefits to marijuana use. Now that we know what it's actually doing in the brain, what it's affecting in a person, what could we do with this research? Well, there's 2 ways they could have went about doing this. Number one, find a way to legalize marijuana so they could test with it. No pharmaceutical company was going to touch that one. So the second idea was to develop these synthetic replacements that act the same way with your CB1 and CB2 receptors to try to find a way to kickstart those or attach to them and discover what different chemicals could do to react with those different receptors. This led to the emergence of synthetic cannabinoids. They were first synthesized by most pharmaceutical companies in the early 90s, but then in the 2000s, they hit the internet. And once it hit the internet, everything broke loose. Clandestine and illicit manufacturing was rampant, and since the DEA wasn't controlling these at the time, since they were new substances, everyone was getting away with it because there was nobody was breaking any laws. So you may be asking, why didn't the DEA control these? Well, the DEA controlling procedure is rough. A substance has to be evaluated against 8 different criteria to determine if it has a potential for abuse, its medical purpose has to be analyzed, and then there has to be hearings about whether or not this should be controlled. That can take years to do this. The other option they have is to do a temporary ban or schedule if it presents an imminent threat to public health. To give you an idea of how the DEA dealt with synthetic cannabinoids, I have a little breakdown of the timeline. So I said, these early cannabinoids hit the internet in the early to mid-2000s. The first group was temporary scheduled in 2011. There was 5 of them. So it took that many years for them to put a temporary ban on 5 of them. By 2011, I think we were aware of about 150 of these. A year passes, March 2012. There was still no regulation of them. They couldn't come to an agreement, so they simply extended the temporary ban on those 5 for another 6 months. No new ones yet. In July of 2012, they passed the Synthetic Drug Abuse Prevention Act, which ended up controlling a lot of them. I don't remember exactly how many it controlled, but a lot of the cannabinoids and the bath salts were put under that act. But if you notice, 2013, they still had the temporary schedule some more. So the DEA is constantly playing catch up, and that only goes to 2013. We got another list in October of 2016 of another, I think, 4 synthetic cannabinoids and 2 bath salts or something like that. So we're still getting these today. Despite this act coming into fruition in 2012, they're still playing catch up. And by the time something comes around to be controlled, they're on to the 3rd next thing. Not even the next thing or the next thing, they're way on down the road. The next problem was analogs. Labs were finding, now that stuff is getting controlled, and the DEA would say, okay, this substance is controlled now. It's illegal. Well, labs were finding that if you change one molecule on it, one little atom, if you have, say, a bromine sticking off, you change that to a chlorine, totally different substance. Doesn't have to be controlled. This created another headache. There is a such thing as the Controlled Substance Analog Law, and that allowed the forensic labs to determine if the cannabinoid was under the control or not. It gave us a little wiggle room. We'll look at the federal analog law. The federal one says that a substance has to be substantially similar in structure, has to be substantially similar in physiological effect, and has to be intended for human consumption. That's the basics of the analog law. New Jersey state analog law is the exact same thing, only we struck out the intended for human consumption. We kind of said, if it quacks like a duck, it's a duck. Well, this led to some more problems for us. The language is very vague. Substantially similar. Well, the sheriff and I are both wearing suits. That's similar, right? Is it similar enough? His is light, mine's dark. So it left a lot of open interpretation for that. Well, I don't want to toot our own horns, but we're pretty good chemists, so if it's structurally similar, we can kind of determine that and say, okay, this is similar, this is why. This is where it's different, this is why. Well, physiologically similar, how are we supposed to determine that? The way we rely on that is published and peer-reviewed literature from scientific journals. However, if we're seeing a substance for the first time, literally for the first time, how is there any published data? And that led to a lot of headaches, a lot of problems, a lot of drawing on whiteboards. And it led to this, the explosion of the legal high products. This is what the sheriff was talking about, sold in gas stations. The labeling was deceptive, marked as potpourri and incense, not for human consumption, so they did everything they could to avoid any detection, only you didn't know what you were getting. This led to a insane public health issue. These substances were very dangerous drugs, and they were a lot more potent than actual marijuana. And as I showed with the e-liquid, more so with these, there was no regulatory oversight. We had a case we actually had several cases where we had two packages that were identical. Same brand, same flavor, same everything. We tested them, two completely different drugs. So people had no idea what they were using. You don't know what the dosage is. To do these chemicals, they're mostly sprayed, these synthetic cannabinoids. They're sprayed on vegetation, marshmallow leaf of some kind, and they just kind of, and then package it. So you might get a hot spot with a lot of it. You might get one that has none. There's just no regulation, oversight, and nobody had any idea what they were taking. So finally, the state said enough's enough. We need to do something about this. And the Department of Consumer Affairs, which regulates New Jersey's list of controlled substances, started this Synthetic Cannabinoid Act. February 2012. There's a red asterisk next to the federal version. The federal version didn't come out until 4 months later. So New Jersey was that much ahead of the federal government as far as dealing with legislature for these synthetic cannabinoids. The New Jersey Act, I say it gets tougher. It really got simpler. They simplified it. They said, they laid down the steps of this is what you need to find in order for this to be considered an illegal substance. So there were 10 categories of basic parent structures for different drugs that said if it's this or it's a similar analog of this, that can fall in this category, plus the one catch-all category where it said any substance that's a cannabinoid receptor agonist. That clarifies it. It still doesn't eliminate the issue of needing to find published literature data to confirm this, but it at least gave us an idea of what we needed to look for, and it made things a lot easier for us. And I will say that this act has done a lot. In this calendar year, I haven't seen a single synthetic cannabinoid yet. The numbers are way down as far as synthetic cannabinoids, so I think that's a direct result of this act doing exactly what it set out to do.
When did that pass?
2013.
And you're just observing that now here we are 3.5 years later, and the world has adjusted to the new reality of that law.
At least in this area.
Yeah.
If you go to other areas, I was just in the Academy meeting in New Orleans. People are still seeing them, but in this county specifically, we're seeing a lot less. What we're seeing more of, the synthetic bath salts, which are stimulants that mimic amphetamine or ecstasy. For a while, we were seeing a lot of them, but we're seeing a little less. The scary thing we're seeing now is the synthetic opiates. You've heard about this in the news, read about it. These are drugs that are extremely dangerous, much more potent than heroin and morphine. I said I went to the Academy meeting in New Orleans, and on Monday I went to a workshop on synthetic opiates. It was in a room this size. We were packed in like sardines because everybody wanted to get in and hear what was being done and everything. And the drugs are just, there's a new one called carfentanil. I don't know if anyone's heard about this. Lethal at 1 milligram. 1 milligram is considered lethal. They use it for tranquilizers for elephants in Africa. We have not seen that yet, at least in our lab. We have not seen that. We've seen other, they're called fentanyl analogs. Furanylfentanyl is one we're seeing a lot of. Butyrylfentanyl. Sufentanil. That's all I can think of off the top of my head, but we're seeing a lot of those.
Excuse me, can you
Yes.
explain a little bit more about what fentanyl is?
Fentanyl is a synthetic opioid, so it's not natural. It doesn't come from an opium poppy like heroin does, and it was originally developed as I think it was an anesthetic, and it's used, now we see it a lot, it's packaged similarly to heroin. Sometimes it has heroin in it as well, sometimes it will have more kinds of that fentanyl. But it's developed synthetically, and it's, I think, regular fentanyl is, 100 times more potent than heroin, which is in turn 100 times more potent than morphine. So
Joseph, the reason
Yes.
they're putting the fentanyl in there is so it's a stronger.
it's a much stronger high, yes. And that was one of the things that I thought was interesting in New Orleans, was that part of that opioid presentation was a person who dealt with heroin addicts, and he asked what the opinion was of fentanyl, and everyone was scared of it. So people are not looking for this, it's just the dealers are packaging it that way. People are not looking for it, and the heroin people are scared of it, but they, unfortunately, they're backed kind of into a corner with what they're going through, and, yeah. So, just a little bit of a conclusion. Ocean County is at the forefront of these emerging drugs. Given our location, we're in unfortunately, the location of us is bad for drugs. Given our location to Philly, New York, Newark, Camden, they kind of surround us. Being a summer destination, people are coming here to have a good time and everything like that. So we're at the forefront of it, and Sheriff Mastronardy has done a tremendous job since he got in about implementing new rules and new regulations about what we're doing with the lab, and we're doing everything we can to make sure we stay ahead of the curve as best we can. So, thank you very much for listening, guys. I really appreciate you coming.
We'll take any questions. I will say, I don't think people appreciate that this is right down here on Chestnut Street. You're doing this work every day, and we're blessed by the talented people.
I am very proud.
Yeah, good.
Michael, as always. Michael,
The
I'm really proud.
marijuana that you're bringing in, it's sprayed, what's in there that it's sprayed with?
That's the synthetic cannabinoids. That's how they make those. So synthetic cannabinoids, they're sometimes called synthetic marijuana, and that's a little misleading because it makes it seem like they're taking marijuana and covering it with these synthetic cannabinoids. But for the most part, they take an inert substance, like I said, they'll take marshmallow leaf or something like that and spray it with the synthetic cannabinoid chemical and then put it in those colorful packages and sell that.
Well, what, marijuana that you just buy like on the street,
Mhm.
not in those packages, not anything to do with the packages, what are you seeing with that marijuana?
That's just THC and the natural chemicals produced by the marijuana.
Oh, okay, so that you're not seeing
Any adulterants or anything like that? No.
Yeah.
Sometimes we get it with PCP. That's kind of rare.
Oh, okay.
But people will either dip their joint in THC or soak their whole vegetation in it, like I said, in the glass jars. We'll put a little PCP in it, shake it up.
Rule about medical marijuana?
Yes, so that's the big point of contention. I said marijuana is a Schedule I, which is clarified as having no medical use. So that's a hotly debated subject at the time. We do see stuff submitted in medical containers. However, that's not really our job to deal with that. We see it, we test it, we say what it is. It's not up to us to interpret what it is really. But we have seen, whether the legitimate medical canisters, I mean, a lot of times it's a prescription thing that somebody printed out off their computer, it looks like, and they put on a prescription bottle and say, look.
It's like a rescue dog at the airport.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
Could you speak a little bit in terms of purity rates? Because in the medical, the regulations say that there's a certain level at which you can only produce the marijuana in terms of THC. But Manny also referenced purity and the higher purity rates of heroin. You know, do you test that? I know DEA publishes that, and that's clearly an issue.
We've read a lot about the increasing purity of both heroin and marijuana. Personally, our lab does not quantify. We used to do it with heroin overdoses, but we kind of moved away from that. It's something we're looking to implement. The sheriff said we're looking to get the lab accredited for the time being. When we get accredited, we'll probably start quanting different things. So unfortunately, I can't really answer that from personal experience, just from what I've read and what I've heard from other labs.
So where's the data sets coming from the, if you know, from the DEA that clearly states that we're in a market here with high purity rates? Obviously, someone's generating that data for them to determine
I
that.
think it's just in general that the drugs are that much stronger, both in this area and across the country. The DEA, I went to the DEA a couple of years ago to their special research and testing lab, which is just outside of Dulles, Virginia. And they get samples from all over the country and are able to compare them both, the heroin, the fentanyl, the marijuana, the methamphetamine that they're seeing, all kinds of stuff, and they get that submitted from all over the country, and that's where they can develop these reports that say this is what we're seeing as far as heroin purity, et cetera, et cetera.
Thank you.
Justin, I think it'd be really important though, if you, if you can become certified and do that quantitative analysis, because we have a bunch of young people that still think pot is pot.
Yeah.
And I tell them, the pot that's on the street is not the pot that I tried out of Dave Schweiker's backyard.
Right.
Okay? So. the
Actually,
levels of
let me just
THC
add, the biggest problem with our certification,
Yeah.
believe it or not, is the county building itself. We're limited, we have too many people, and they want so much space per foot for equipment. And we have like 2 drying tanks, one for victims and one for, but they shouldn't be together, and we have to do them. So we're working on that, the freeholders are now authorized, and we're bringing the CSI investigators into the old communication center. So the lab that is currently housing those units will only have the lab there, and that's a major thing. But even though we had consultants come in, they hired consultants from Chicago, I believe, and they came in and basically said, we need a new goddamn building, we just make it the freehold. Ron thinks that. So that's the main holdup for getting the lab certified. We bought all this equipment, but then we didn't have the staff on. We're hiring the staff now to calibrate it. So the equipment's sitting there and we haven't, it's calibrated, but it hasn't been verified.
That's why I said with the testing, the postmortem drugs and blood, we haven't, like you said, the instruments are just sitting there. Our backlog is so much that we've been playing catch up. So it's a question of what we want to stop doing for a day. We'll get off the drug cases for a day, work on the instrument, then come back to the drug cases.
It's like
Deal with cleaning
starting a bus company, buying a bus and having no drivers. So we're working on it. We're getting there.
Yes.
When you get your lab set up completely the way you want it, will it afford the young people to come and take a tour?
No, because in certification, you have to restrict who can go there. What we're going to do is produce videos. They can go into like an auditorium and look at the videos of what's taking place. Like we had you through the lab. You're probably one of our last tours. We're probably, but you have to limit access because you don't want anybody contaminate anything.
But I was thinking in terms of trying to help our young people to see if there's another education.
Right, and we think we can do that through video.
Okay.
As opposed to physically going through the lab and subject to contamination.
That's fine.
I won't even go in the lab.
He did, that's what he got me. Kind of poked his head.
I did.
Anything else?
Anyhow, again, I say we're very blessed to have the talented people we have here. He lives now in Stafford, and Matt lives in Jackson. And, they're here. These are very educated and very dedicated people, very blessed.
Matt's getting his PhD in a couple weeks.
All right.
Dr. Wood.
Great job.